In the early spring, before the leaves come out of the deciduous trees, wildflowers take advantage of all the light that falls to the forest floor. The canopy is more open, thus allowing sunlight to come through before the leaves grow on the trees. Now we're well into the spring, and newer wildflowers are emerging and flowering. Flowers like Trillium, spring beauties, lobed hepatica flower early before the sunlight is diminished. Now we're well into May, so let's look for other flowers that are flowering now when it's shady on the forest floor. Trilliums have already flowered. Now we just see the 3 leaves. There's a few remnant blossoms left. This is the 3-petaled large flowered Trillium, or white Trillium. It's a variable species that can be long-lived. It can live up to 25 years. The red Trillium, its relative, also known as the purple Trillium, flowers early as well to take advantage of the sunlight on the forest floor. The red Trillium is also known as Stinking Benjamin. It has no nectar, but it attracts flies and carrion beetles because of its odor. Here's another white Trillium. Some people come to me and ask, there's a pink Trillium growing down on the Lakeview Trail. As the flower matures and senesces, it turns pink and purple. This flower has probably already been pollinated and ready to set seed. Again, Trilliums are an early spring wildflower that develop quickly using available sunlight. Now there's less sunlight on the forest floor, so other types of wildflowers are taking advantage of this period. Maples spread underground with rhizomes so they can be found in large clusters. These beautiful umbrella-like plants remind me of tropical trees. If you find a mayapple with a double stem, then you might see a blossom. They have a nodding blossom of 5 to 8 petals underneath the forked stem. This will be pollinated by flies and beetles and develop a small green fruit that will slowly turn yellow and then ripen into what is known as the mayapple. At that point, the mayapple is edible, and some people collect them to make jams and jellies. The green fruit is toxic, so be aware. This is the mayapple. Here's a clonal group of wild Sarsaparilla. Its tropical relatives were used in soda, you might have heard. Sarsaparilla soda. Flowers occur in terminal clusters, and they have just started flowering. It's in the ginseng family, so the plant is very similar to wild ginseng, which is very rare now due to over-collecting. So this is wild Sarsaparilla. Groups can be hundreds of years old, growing in the forest underground in elaborate root systems that are all interconnected. So in some ways, this cluster could be considered one plant. Here's a large stand of wild Sarsaparilla growing along the Hemlock Hollow Trail. Obviously, this plant is very shade tolerant. Gets very little sunlight during the summer because of the towering hemlocks. And here's a spring pollinator approaching a mayflower. Bumblebees are important pollinators in the forest. This is probably a queen trying to establish a nest under that pine needle leaf litter. Further along the Hemlock Hollow Trail, you may come upon a beautiful small purple flower. This is known as gay wings or fringed polygula, also called flowering wintergreen, as the leaves stay green. Two beautiful purple wings meet to form a tubular flower, and one of the petals has fringes. Fringed polygula, beautiful spring wildflower. Here's a nice cluster of gay wings or fringed polygula near the edge of the bog trail. In the background are some Canada mayflowers, which will be discussed a little later. Fringed polygula. Here, growing at the base of this red maple, isn't a spring wildflower, it's a spring mushroom. The highly prized morel. This is a yellow morel. It's an ascomycete, which has its spores on a surface called the ascus, or a sac. Unlike the basidiomycetes, which the spores are borne on the gills underneath. This is a choice edible, highly sought by mycologists and mycophiles. It's difficult to cultivate, so wild mushrooms are the only way to collect it. The yellow morel. This is a patch of Canada mayflower. It's also called wild lily of the valley. It's got a lovely cluster of terminal white flowers growing in rich forests, sometimes associated with white pines. We're out on the Bog Island near the edge of the lake and found this cluster of Canada mayflowers. This flowering plant contains no chlorophyll, so it parasitizes oak trees and beech trees. This is known as squaw root or bear corn. You can see the resemblance to a cob of corn. It feeds off the roots of these trees by sinking haustorium, or organs that draw the nutrients from the roots, because it can't produce its own food. This plant is about to flower, and it has brownish green flowers. This is bear corn. It's a beautiful star-shaped flower. In fact, it's called starflower. It's a 7 to 9 petaled white flower, which grows in rich forests. It can also be found on the bog trail. The starflower at the base of this white pine tree on the Bog Island. And Canada mayflower. Now on the bog boardwalk in the full sun, there are a wide variety of flowering plants in the spring. As we approach, we see the flowers of the most famous plant of the bog, the pitcher plant. Everyone knows the pitcher plant traps insects in the water in its pitcher-like specialized leaves. Here are the fascinating waxy red flowers of the pitcher plant. that attract flies and beetles to pollinate. Pitcher plants are one of 2 insectivorous plants found in the bog, the other being the sundew, a fascinating pitcher plant of the bog at Beaver Lake. This is the other insectivorous plant found in the bog, the tiny sundew. Its leaves are coated with sticky hairs that catch insects. Similar to the pitcher plant, they quote-unquote digest the insect and absorb nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, which are very limiting here in the bog. It hasn't flowered yet, but it has a tiny white flower soon to pop out on a stalk in the center of the plant. This is the tiny sundew. Blueberries can also be found in the bog, and this is the time of year that they flower. Middle of spring, look along the bog boardwalk for the hanging white bell-shaped flowers of the blueberry. Birds like Baltimore orioles and other species feast upon the blueberries when they're ripe. Here we are at a large blueberry bush in the bog. Tucked back in on a hummock along the bog trail is a beautiful showy orchid, one of the largest northern orchids in North America, the pink lady slipper, also known as moccasin flower. It's pollinated by large insects like bumblebees that enter the flower through a fold. They get inside and literally bumble around and pollinate this beautiful flower. Pink lady slippers are rare as they grow in acidic or basic soils like that found here in the bog. Back in the dark forest, there's a large mat of sweet woodruff, clusters of small white flowers. This is a Geranium genus, which are related to bedstraw and that nasty weed, cleavers, also known as sticky willy. Bedstraw is native to Europe, but it does well here in our dark forest on the Lakeview Trail. Sweet woodruff gets its name from its aromatic flowers, which attract a variety of pollinators. It grows well in the shade and is often used as an ornamental beneath trees in people's shady yards. There are some tall plants that have already flowered and have set seed. This is an early spring wildflower that takes advantage of the sunlight on the forest floor before the leaves grow on the trees. This is blue cohosh. It's called blue cohosh because the new shoots and emerging leaves have a bluish hue to them. This beautiful plant will start turning yellow and senescing as the sunlight gets more and more diminished. Growing nearby a blue cohosh plant, there is the false Solomon seal. It differs from the true Solomon seal in that the flower cluster is at the end of the group of leaves. The true Solomon seal has bell-shaped flowers which grow underneath the leaf stem. This plant prefers shady forests and can be seen along many trails like the Lakeview, Deep Woods, Hemlock Hollow. The true Solomon seal likes richer limestone soils like Green Lakes and Clark Reservation, so isn't commonly seen at Beaver Lake. The small white flowers on this plant are just about to open up, awaiting pollinators like small flies and midges. Look for it along the trails. Another later spring flowering plant that grows in the deep dark forest is white baneberry. Its terminal cluster of small white flowers will be pollinated and turn into a white berry with a dark center. Therefore it gets its other name called doll's eyes. The white baneberry growing here at the base of a white ash. A very interesting and showy flower that can be seen along the trails of Beaver Lake, especially in rich forests, is the arum flower called Jack in the Pulpit. This flap-like spathe, if lifted, reveals a club-like spadix, the jack. On that spadix are very, very tiny flowers. Some plants have primarily female flowers, other plants primarily male flowers. Insects crawl in and out when they're attracted to the flower, going to another plant of the opposite sex and pollinating it. The three leaves are prominent. Larger plants, like this one, are probably dominated by female flowers on the spadix. Jack in the Pulpit. Another arum flower is found out in the swamps and bogs called arum. Look for it later in the summer. In wetter areas, in early spring, one of the first flowers seen blooming is the beautiful yellow Marsh Marigold, also known as cowslips. These plants here have already flowered and are done and ready to go to seed. Some people boil the leaves several times to remove the oxalic acid crystals, therefore making them edible. This is Marsh Marigold. In the background, a swamp saxophrage. We'll go around the corner here and get a closer look. Now we'll take a closer look at swamp saxophrage, which is in the Miterwort family. First, a cluster of leaves grow from the swamp. These hairy leaves produce a spike of flowers. Here it's in full flower, whitish green flowers. Again, this is a wetland plant, and its cousin, the false miterwort or foam flower, can also be found in this habitat. So this is swamp saxophrage. Another plant of the wet forest and swampy woodlands, the miterwort. Looks very close to the foam flower, which is known as false miterwort. The difference is the flowers are on a spike and there are leaves that come off the stem. So this is miterwort, a tiny flowered plant growing here off the woodland trail in a very rich, wet woodland. Here in another wet area, by comparison, is found the false miterwort or foam flower. So compared to the true miterwort, the flowers are much different. They appear in a terminal cluster, are larger, and you can see the leaves come from the base of the plant and aren't found along the stem, as in the true miterwort. So this is foam flower, often planted as an ornamental in people's gardens. Here, enjoying the rich, wet soils along the deep woods trail. Here in a sunny patch along the deep woods trail, a plant that many people know as one of the most prominent invasives at Beaver Lake, the garlic mustard. Here it's still flowering. Early pollinators do enjoy this plant because it's one of the first to flower along the trail. It was grown as a culinary herb and escaped greenhouses in New Jersey in the late 1800s. Now it spreads ferociously along the trail, oftentimes choking out native wildflowers like Trillium. The leaves can be used in salads or used in a pesto, similar to basil pesto. This is garlic mustard. Here's one of the earliest flowering plants, the skunk cabbage. It's an arum type flower, similar to that found in Jack in the Pulpit and arrow arum of the wetlands. Its flower can grow through thin ice and snow. In the growing tip of the flower, a chemical reaction occurs that causes some heat to be generated, which helps it to melt through the snow and ice to be one of the first flowers in the spring. Here it is found along the Deep Woods Trail. It's very common in swamps along the Lake Loop Boardwalk as well. This tiny purple flower with 5 petals starts flowering about now, the middle of May, and can flower well into September. It's called Herb Robert, and it's a wild geranium. It's quite common, found along woodland trails like here we are on the Deep Woods Trail. So keep an eye out for this beautiful pink purple flower, Herb Robert. A relative of the Herb Robert is the wild geranium. This beautiful pink 5-petaled flower is also called cranesbill. It's difficult to see, but in the center of the flower is a long spike, similar looking to that of a crane's bill. Next to it, a wildflower that comes very early, called bloodroot. Taking advantage of the early sunshine through the leafless forest, the white flower emerges and within a few days is pollinated, senesces, and sets fruit. It's called bloodroot because of the yellow-orange sap that comes from its stem if broken. So the wildflowers of Beaver Lake are beautiful and prevalent in the rich forest. Journey out in search of these gems of the woods.